So I noticed that when people talk about, or when songs sing about staying in and being cozy during the Christmas season, they often talk about watching black and white movies. And it got me thinking, okay, other than the maybe two really obvious ones, what are all of these black and white Christmas movies? And if you're wondering the same thing, you're in the right place, because today I'm going to be talking about my top 10 black and white Christmas movies. Let's get festive, let's get a hot beverage, and let's do this. How's it going, my friends? Welcome again to the Cobwebs channel, a very special Christmas edition of the Cobwebs channel. My name is Daniel, and I'm really excited to tell you my list of my top 10 black and white Christmas movies. So for the ranking of this list, I did a little bit of a mix of the quality of the movie, my enjoyment of it, and overall how Christmassy it is. More on that a little bit later. Don't forget to hop on down to the comment section and let me know some of your favorite vintage Christmas films, or just black and white Christmas films like I'm going to talk about. Speaking of which, let's get started with my number 10, which is Scrooge from 1951. Ebenezer Scrooge bitterly shuffles through life as a cruel, miserly businessman until he is visited by three ghosts on Christmas Eve, who show him how his unhappy childhood and his now adult behavior have left him a selfish, lonely old man. Can there be hope for Ebenezer Scrooge? Of course, this is one of the many adaptations of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I love the A Christmas Carol story. This is one of my favorite stories of all time. Of course, it's an absolutely beautiful story with a wonderful message, but also I love the very old-fashioned British idea of ghost stories being traditional for the Christmas season. That's just something I feel like we should bring back, and A Christmas Carol is, of course, the best example of that. But I checked this one out specifically for making this video. I'd never actually seen it before. I know from childhood and from seeing many times, I know the Patrick Stewart version, the George C. Scott version. I'm also a huge fan of A Muppets Christmas Carol, so there's a lot of different versions that I love. And this is one when I went into it, I was just hoping for something to make it stand out, something to make it a little bit different, so I didn't feel like I was watching the exact same thing, just not the version that I love with my heart. And that's mostly what I did end up getting, to be honest with you. Most every version of A Christmas Carol is extremely similar, but this one actually did differentiate itself in a couple of ways, which I did appreciate. Now, first of all, Alastair Sim plays Scrooge, and I thought he was fantastic. I've only recently started discovering what a fan I am of Alastair Sim as an actor, and I was a huge fan of his performance. I thought he was very believable as this bitter, miserly old man, and in a way that he didn't make him too cartoony. He very much felt like a real person. But his transition over the course of the movie into, of course, his heart being grown 3 times, like the Grinch or something, was also very believable and very natural. And I really liked him by the end of the movie. But also this movie spends a lot more time than most versions I've seen on the Christmas past part. It spends way more time on Christmas past than present or future. And that meant we got to see some things that I've never seen in any other version that aren't in the book. Like we actually see Scrooge at his sister Fran's bedside as she's dying. And I noticed that really sparked more empathy for him in me than I normally feel by that point of the story. You really start to understand his bitterness when you watch him go through that. You also watch him deal with the death of Marley, and he's at Marley. There's a lot more death in this version that you can see, apparently. This is not a great version, but I thought it was good. Am I going to reach for it instead of one with George C. Scott, Patrick Stewart, or Michael Caine in the Muppets one? No. But it's a good black and white Christmas Carol version. And if you're in the mood for a black and white movie and a Christmas Carol, can't go wrong here. At number 9 is a movie that would be way higher if it's just based on quality, but this is, I would say, by far the least Christmassy movie on the list, although it does technically count, and that is The Thin Man from 1934. In this charming and hilarious whodunit, William Powell and Myrna Loy star as Nick and Nora Charles, a husband and wife detective team who drink and banter their way through solving the mystery of a missing inventor and perhaps almost get killed in the process. So I've got The Thin Man on the Warner Archive Blu-ray, and this movie actually spawned 5 sequels. There's 6 total The Thin Man movies, and I am a huge fan of this movie. It's one of my favorite old black and white films. These two actors, William Powell and Myrna Loy, are just unbelievably charming in this. The dialogue here is insanely sharp. Like, it just blows me away how well written it is, how fast paced it is. You just watch this adorable couple who don't have problems with their marriage in the movie. That's something that I like. A lot of times movies, sort of create conflict because they think like it'll be boring if we don't. But this is a rare movie that just depicts a husband and wife team as a team who works well together, who enjoy each other's company, who make each other laugh and drink a lot together. There's a lot of drinking in this movie, which I think adds to the comedy. The mystery that they're solving here is pretty good. It's not a fascinating mystery. I actually think the sequel, Another Thin Man, has a better mystery and a more dramatic final reveal that's more memorable. This movie doesn't have that quite so much, but it doesn't change the fact that I give this movie a 5 out of 5 because it's ridiculously fun. I love it so much. But why is it a Christmas movie? Well, because part of it takes place at Christmas. In fact, the sequel picks up right where this movie left off at New Year's. So it kind of goes through the whole Christmas and New Year's season. There's a pretty fun scene on Christmas morning where they're opening presents and William Powell got some kind of a cap gun or BB gun, I don't know, that he's shooting at things. And it's a fun little Christmas scene. Not a Christmassy movie, but technically counts. And if you're looking for something a little different to watch this December, oh my gosh, The Thin Man's like one of my favorite movies, so like check it out. But at number 8, we've got a way more explicitly Christmassy movie. This is Christmas in Connecticut from 1945. So this movie opens up with a war hero who is recovering in a hospital, and while he's there, he becomes a really big fan of this magazine column, Diary of a Housewife, written by Elizabeth Lane, played by Barbara Stanwyck. His nurse arranges with her publisher for him to get to spend Christmas with her at her Connecticut farm with her husband and child, but it turns out the column is a sham. Barbara Stanwyck is just a city girl who's just writing this column to make money. So in order to save herself from losing her job, she fakes a family life at a farm in Connecticut, but not just the war hero comes for Christmas, but also her publisher himself. And it's a big old mess. And it's a really, really fun romantic screwball comedy. I've enjoyed Christmas in Connecticut for many years. If you just want like a classic 40s screwball comedy, but also want it to be a Christmas movie, I mean, you just cannot go wrong with this thing. Barbara Stanwyck is, of course, ridiculously charming in this. She's such a phenomenal lead for just this kind of movie. We just love watching her. She's so relatable and likable as this just very normal single woman living out in the city, and watching her just try to fake this whole situation is so funny. I've actually seen like multiple like Hallmark Christmas movie kind of movies. I don't even know if they're actually Hallmark that steal this exact plot, and do it much, much worse. So if you want to see like great actors in grade A Hollywood make that kind of Hallmarky movie, that's exactly what this is. But I thought the movie is still very relevant today because the whole idea of her faking a newspaper column just about being a mom and being a housewife, I mean, like, that's so much of like TikTok and Instagram. I mean, I know my wife follows a lot of TikTok and Instagram accounts where it's just women documenting being a mom and being a housewife, and that's like all it is. So she's basically like an influencer, except it's just a magazine column because it's the 1940s. And the idea that she's just faking it all and it's all a sham, there's a lot of faking going on social media. I'm not saying some of those mom TikToks are like AI animating kids so they can make money, although it's possible. I wouldn't rule it out. But I just thought the movie has stayed very, very relevant because what she's doing carries over to today completely. The one thing I don't like about this movie so much is the main guy, who I'm not very familiar with outside of this movie, but his name is Dennis Morgan as the war hero, and she starts falling in love with him, and he just doesn't have that movie star charisma for me. I think if you got somebody in this movie like a Gary Cooper, man, you could really, really have something. But this guy's just kind of flat for me. Just feels like kind of a generic dude. There's just not much that's very interesting about him. And also, they start flirting with each other and like getting real into each other really fast. And when you consider that as far as he knows, she's a married woman with a baby, it makes him less likable that he's flirting with her almost immediately. So that is a little bit of a problem for me. I wish there was a little more conflict regarding that and they weren't flirting so hardcore. I mean, I watched this with my wife last night and she's like, oh my gosh, they're like really going at it. for a 1940s movie. But the movie is super, super Christmassy. It's got a lot of Christmas music. It's got a tree decorating scene. It's got tons of snow out in the country. I mean, this is a total like Christmas cottagecore kind of movie. It's got a sleigh ride with horses. I mean, this is one of the most Christmassy movies you're probably ever going to see. So if you want some good black and white Christmas vibes, I mean, I'm putting a little bit lower because I love it less than the movies up top, but it's exactly what you're looking for. At number 7 is It Happened on Fifth Avenue from 1947. So this movie opens up with a very charming New York hobo who moves into an abandoned mansion, abandoned because the owner moves away from that house in somewhere tropical for the winter. And he just goes in to live there because nobody's living there anyway. And along the way, he kind of just accumulates a lot of different friends who end up living there with him. A lot of other people who have fallen on hard times during the Great Depression. And it's all during the Christmas season. And along the way, he might just end up accidentally living with the actual homeowners. I actually just checked this movie out on this Warner Archive Blu-ray. And for a little while, I was wondering if I had heard wrong that it was actually a Christmas movie. But it's about an hour into the movie. This movie is about 2 hours long. So it's about halfway through that suddenly it becomes the Christmas season. And at that point, we get snow. We get a snow shoveling scene. We get another Christmas tree decorating scene. It becomes very Christmassy at that point. And it also really follows just the Christmas message about giving to those less fortunate, because the movie is very much about the Great Depression. Like, I think in the context of the 1940s was probably seen as a somewhat political movie because it's all about the terrible hard times that so many people have fallen under. And then the dramatic inequality with the rich people who literally have more houses than they need and are just bouncing around houses just for the fun of it to find better climates. So all of that is some pretty good commentary. It's also got a couple of young lovers characters, a couple of young people who end up falling for each other. And I was not familiar with either of these actors, but they're very charming, if a little bit generic. But it really doesn't matter that they're generic because it turns out this movie is much more about the old men. It focuses much more so on the original old hobo who first moves into that house and the millionaire who owns the house, who ends up going into the mansion undercover, pretending to be a hobo so he can meet his daughter's new fiance. Those are the two young lovers I was talking about, without him knowing that she's actually a rich girl, so she can find out if he really loves her for her. And the way the movie shifts focus to those two old guys is actually really great because I really, really liked both of them. Their performances, their characters. I thought they were really interesting. The character of the millionaire became such an interesting guy, just watching him transition from this super stuffy, snotty rich guy into somebody. It's a little bit of a Christmas Carol story, actually, a little less dramatic. He's less horrible than Scrooge, but it is a little bit of a Christmas Carol kind of a story. So I ended up really liking this. I do think it's too long. That's my big criticism. It's 2 hours long, does not need to be. At a certain point, I was like, okay, I like this movie, but we really need to be wrapping this thing up. But otherwise, it's a solid black and white Christmas movie, which is some really good vibes and a good message. Okay, at this point, if you're getting tired of hearing about nice, sweet, romantic, good message movies, okay, this is the time. We are taking a break from that. At number 6, we've got Cash on Demand from 1961. A charming but ruthless criminal holds the family of a bank manager hostage as part of a cold-blooded plan to steal almost 100,000 pounds from the bank. If the manager doesn't do everything he tells him to, his family will be killed. So this is actually a Hammer movie. Hammer is one of my favorite studios of all time. They made tons of phenomenal movies back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, primarily horror films, but this is a crime thriller that I have on this Mill Creek 20 film Hammer film collection. Peter Cushing, who did a ton of Hammer films, playing Dr. Frankenstein and Van Helsing, just for instance, stars as this bank manager, and he's literally like one of my top 5 actors of all time. I'm like obsessed with Peter Cushing, and he's awesome in this movie. And this movie is also a little bit of a Christmas Carol story. It takes place on Christmas Eve, and Cushing opens up the movie as just being this very cold bank manager, very uncaring, not a nice guy. But as he's going through this horrible experience where Andre Morel's character comes in pretending to be some kind of bank investigator, and they just start giving him everything he wants because he's a bank investigator and he seems very professional and he's charming. But when it turns out he's a bank robber, his charming performance becomes so cold and evil, but still in a very charismatic way. He's a very charismatic villain who I really, really enjoyed watching. And as Peter Cushing's character is going through this experience, it just starts softening him more as you really just feel his stress, like really, really hardcore in this movie. It's a very intense single location, all in this bank, crime thriller that I think is fantastic, but all takes place on Christmas Eve. There's snow outside. You hear Christmas music at the end, and it does feel like it's a little bit of a Christmas carol. It's the softening of a bitter, money-hungry guy's heart as he's going through a frightening experience. So I think Cash on Demand is phenomenal. One of the great underrated gems of the whole Christmas genre. At number 5 is another one that probably would be higher just based on quality, but because of Christmas, I lowered it a bit. This is The Shop Around the Corner from 1940. Two employees at a gift shop can barely stand one another, but then realize that they are falling in love through the mail as each other's anonymous pen pal. So I actually don't own The Shop Around the Corner on Blu-ray because I have it as a bonus disc in this You've Got Mail Blu-ray. You open it up and there's The Shop Around the Corner right there. I still haven't upgraded it to Blu-ray, so that's still how I own the movie. But why is it in a You've Got Mail Blu-ray? Well, that's because this is actually a remake of The Shop Around the Corner that is originally an adaptation of a play, but this adaptation is directed by Ernst Lubitsch, who's one of my favorite directors of all time. It stars Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan as the pen pals. They are phenomenal in this, of course. Jimmy Stewart has to be a little bit unlikable because of sometimes how he treats Margaret Sullivan, why they're always in conflict. But because he's Jimmy Stewart, he's just incredibly charming the whole way through just because you love him so much. And Margaret Sullivan, I haven't seen her in a ton of other movies other than this, but she is so good in this. I think she's so cute and sweet, but also mean sometimes as they're butting heads. The Shop Around the Corner is just ridiculously well written. If you're a fan of the scene in You've Got Mail where Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan meet,
I think you discover a lot of things if you really knew me.
If I really knew you, I know what I would find. Instead of a brain, a cash register. Instead of a heart, a bottom line.
Well, I really wouldn't care to scratch your surface, Mr. Crowley, because I know exactly what I'd find. Instead of a heart, a handbag. Instead of a soul, a suitcase. And instead of an intellect, a cigarette lighter, which doesn't work.
that scene is directly out of The Shop Around the Corner. So, so much of what you might love about You've Got Mail came from this movie. Now, the movie's not Christmassy all throughout, but it does end on Christmas Eve. It ends on like their biggest night at their store of the year, which is Christmas Eve. And that's when everything comes together. So it does have some good Christmas vibes by the end. But I do warn you, it's not through the whole movie. But man, The Shop Around the Corner is just one of my favorite romantic comedies. It's awesome. At number 4 is one of my favorite Christmas movie discoveries of the last few years. I've really come to love this film, and that is Holiday Affair from 1949. So just before Christmas, a department store clerk, played by Robert Mitchum, meets a big spending customer, played by Janet Leigh, who's actually a comparison shopper sent by another store. The store doesn't take kindly to that, but Robert Mitchum lets her go, which gets him fired, and they then spend the afternoon together. This doesn't sit well with her fiance, played by Wendell Corey, but her young son, Timmy, quickly takes to him. Like Christmas in Connecticut, this is a pretty standard Christmas romantic comedy, exactly the kind of plot, the kind of thing that like Hallmark would make during the Christmas season. But the difference is this has a lot of talent behind it. It's incredibly well made, and it has phenomenal movie stars. Robert Mitchum, okay? He's mostly known for doing noir and westerns, and he's one of my favorite actors for doing those things. But it's really great to see him in a romantic comedy. He just doesn't do this kind of thing very often, and he's fantastic. I really like his character because he's a guy who's just incredibly direct and never beats around the bush.
Connie, I think Carl is just about one of the nicest fellows I could ever hope to meet. But I think you ought to marry me.
He just like comes right out and says it. And I really appreciate that because I feel like this kind of movie would normally, this whole love triangle thing, it would have like him having all these schemes to try to like win her heart or like get rid of this guy or something like that. And he doesn't do any of that. He just says it like, nah, you'd be happier with me. We should probably get married. And that just makes me really like him. Now, Connie is played by Janet Leigh, Marion Crane from Psycho, one of my favorite actresses, just one of the most beautiful, charming, just ethereal women to like ever walk the earth. I just love her in like pretty much everything she's ever done, and she's awesome in this. They're so great together. And Wendell Corey is the fiance. I like the fiance character because he really is a super nice guy. He's a good dude. And I like that in romantic comedies when like the wrong person, Mr. Wrong, is not some kind of cartoon villain, not like evil in some kind of unrealistic way. A good guy who's just not the right guy. Like I usually reference Patrick Dempsey in Sweet Home Alabama. He's like my poster child for this. And Wendell Corey fits into that really well. So a very Christmassy movie. It's got Christmas dinner, Christmas trees, snow in New York City. Really, really great vibes and just a really good rom-com. At number 3 is the movie that I thought for sure would be number 2, but a rewatch ended up upsetting that. But this is one of the most obvious movies to make the list. It is Miracle on 34th Street from 1947. You guys know this story. Kris Kringle, who seems to be the embodiment of the real Santa Claus, is asked to portray the jolly old fellow at Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. His portrayal is so good that they end up asking him to play Santa Claus at Macy's full time, and they start to question if he is insane or if he really is Santa Claus. One of the most classic Christmas movies of all time. I've been watching this movie ever since I was a little kid. I have always loved it. You know, it's just got such a great cast. You gotta love Maureen O'Hara as the leading lady who's a Macy's executive, a single mom of her daughter, played by Natalie Wood. As an adult, Natalie Wood would go on to become one of my favorite actresses of all time. She very much raises her to be very practical, not believe in fairy tales. So she's just this very kind of precocious, critical thinking little kid who's very entertaining. But even she starts to question if Kris Kringle really is Santa Claus because Edmund Gwynn is so good in the role. I would say he actually is my favorite on-screen Santa. I definitely can't think of anyone better. He's someone that like, he looks like Santa, but the main reason you start to believe he is because he's just so good. He's so kind and decent and gets along with everyone and is so wonderful to everyone around him. You just start to think there's no way this guy is a normal person. Like he's got to be magical. He's got to be Santa Claus. And it devolves into becoming a courtroom drama about proving if he's Santa Claus. It's all very entertaining, very fun, very sweet. And I'll also shout out the 1990s remake. I actually like that almost as much. Not quite as much, but that's also a really good movie. Now, my number 2 is the big upset, and I'll get into why. This is The Bishop's Wife from 1947. So this is about an Episcopal bishop named Henry, played by David Niven, who's been working for months on the plans of an elaborate new cathedral, which he hopes will be paid for primarily by a wealthy, stubborn widow. He's losing sight of his family and why he became a bishop in the first place. Enter Dudley, an angel played by Cary Grant, who is sent to help him. Dudley helps everyone he meets, and with the exception of Henry, everyone loves him. But Henry begins to believe that Dudley is there to replace him, both at work and in his wife's heart. So my dad loved this movie growing up, and for that reason, I saw it a lot growing up, but I never loved it. It was never a movie that connected with me. It was never one of my favorite Christmas movies. It was just one that he watched, and I never rewatched it as an adult. I wasn't even sure it was going to make this list, but I thought, well, you know, that's a classic black and white Christmas movie. I should probably give it another watch and see how it is, what I think of it now. And I loved this movie now. I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. And I totally understand why I didn't connect with it as a kid, because I do think it's a very adult, mature movie about very adult concerns. Now, as a grown-up, I really connected with this movie. I thought it was just so beautiful. I thought it had an incredible message about what churches should be doing to help people. It's got a really hard hitting message about how churches maybe shouldn't build big churches. Maybe that's not how they should be spending their money. Maybe they should spend their money on actually helping people. And that's what Dudley's really pushing for. Like he talks about it. This is the Great Depression. Like this money should be going towards the poor. And that's a message that's like, I think maybe even more relevant now than it was then. Like, I think it's a message that would make people mad now, but here it is, them hitting it hard in 1947. I really respected that, but also just the way that David Niven's character, I just love him. I love him in this movie, and I just connected with him so much. He's not like a Scrooge character where like he's like evil and becomes good, but he's very much just lost sight of what's important in life, and in a way that I think all of us do at certain points in our lives. And this movie and Dudley the angel in this movie really make you reflect on what really matters. I love Cary Grant in this film. Just one of the most charming actors of all time. One of the most charming performances he probably ever gave. Just love this guy. He's kind of like Edmund Gwynn in Miracle on 34th Street, where you start to believe he's magical just because he's so good. But oh my gosh, Loretta Young as the bishop's wife. Also, like Janet Leigh, just one of the most beautiful, ethereal, charming women who ever walked the earth. Like, you just cannot help but fall totally in love with her. And, you know, you understand kind of Dudley's conflict towards the end of this movie where he says something to David Niven like, you know, it's not good when an angel starts to envy the man that he's sent to help. And you understand why, because Loretta Young, oh my gosh. So The Bishop's Wife is an awesome movie. I just thought it was so entertaining, so well written. The characters are so likable. Performance is so good. This also has a Christmas tree decorating scene. It's got lots of snow. It's very, very Christmassy. If you haven't seen this or haven't seen it in a long time, like I hadn't, this is the Christmas to check this out again. But at my number one, and there was absolutely no question what number one was going to be. I mean, it's not just my favorite Christmas movie. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. I think I could possibly make the argument it's the best movie ever made, and that is It's a Wonderful Life from 1946. George Bailey has spent his entire life giving to the people of his town, Bedford Falls. All that prevents rich, bitter businessman Mr. Potter from taking over the entire town is George's modest building and loan company. But on Christmas Eve, the business loses $8,000 and George starts to question if his life is even worth it. Then comes an angel to perhaps change his mind. Now, I have loved this movie ever since I was a kid. It's pretty much always been my favorite Christmas movie of all time. I rewatch it every year and it always makes me emotional. This movie is probably more responsible for like my worldview and my personal morals than like any other movie ever made. It really is just that important to me. It's the story of a man who becomes the most important and most beloved man in his community. And he doesn't even know what's happening while it's happening because he thinks his life is kind of falling apart because it's not what he intended his life to be, but it's because he just gives and gives everything he has to this town. And it's not until the end of the movie where you really realize how worth it is. A lot of people remember the end of the movie because it's so life affirming. It's so encouraging. It's just the most like beautiful movie ending I've ever seen. It's like the only ending that'll make me cry every single time. But people often forget how dark the movie is leading up to that. And that's what makes the ending work so well, is this movie absolutely puts George Bailey, played by Jimmy Stewart, through hell. Like, he goes through so much hardships through this movie that when you get to the end of the movie, it's like this insane emotional catharsis, like this crazy relief. This might be the best performance of all time, Jimmy Stewart in this movie. Like, he goes through the entire spectrum of human experience. Like, he's happy and young, then he's bitter and older, he's angry, he's unsatisfied, he's romantic. The tension between Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed, like, oh my gosh, they're so phenomenal together. The chemistry is off the charts, but he's angry, he's unlikable, he's lovable. Like, he's everything in this movie. This is like my favorite performance of all time. That's what I'm getting around to say. Jimmy Stewart's incredible. And I also love how this is not a Christmas Carol story with Mr. Potter. Mr. Potter is just a villain, played by Lionel Barrymore, one of the best movie villains of all time. And I like that he's never redeemed. The movie doesn't go there. Like, no, he's just a horrible person. He's always going to be horrible. We're focused on George Bailey. Don't even worry about that awful guy. I kind of love that about this movie too. It's a Wonderful Life is my favorite Christmas movie of all time. So of course, it's number one. Thank you so much for watching, folks. If you enjoyed this, I've got a ton of other videos on my channel, a lot of ranking lists, a lot of talking about vintage old movies. Give a like if you enjoy this and subscribe for more videos like this. Merry Christmas and happy holidays. I hope you have a wonderful one. I'll see you next time.